Now that the South had officially seceded from the Union after the election of 1860, you see the secession of 11 states in total. But the war didn't actually really begin even as soon as the South seceded. The firing on Fort Sumter is going to mark kind of the beginning of actual action. So what happens at Fort Sumter after the South seceded? These the Confederate government began going in and completely taking over a lot of these forts. Fort Sumter in Charleston, South Carolina, was the last holdout, and they were running out of supplies, and they are essentially surrounded by Confederates. Abraham Lincoln had a really tough decision to make. If he chose to go in and resupply that fort and send in reinforcements, that would be seen as an act of aggression. Abraham Lincoln did not want to do that. He basically wanted to say, I am only sending in food for hungry soldiers. That way, it would leave it to the South to take action if that was going to happen. And that's exactly what does happen. Basically, the Confederates give those inside the fort an ultimatum. So when they did not surrender by that specific date and time, they did open fire. This really was not a bloody battle by any means. We call it the first shots of the Civil War because it really wasn't a battle. So when you talk about the first shots of the war, you're going to say is Fort Sumter. But the Union does have to surrender in the end because part of the fort catches fire. They didn't have any supplies left, and they do eventually surrender. They were actually allowed to surrender in a very dignified way because remember, when this happens, this is going to immediately pit people against one another that had been friends before this, that had been possibly even relatives before this, mentors before this. So this is what's going to happen at Fort Sumter. So after the firing on Fort Sumter, even though the Confederate states weren't completed yet, this is going to lead to Virginia seceding, Arkansas, North Carolina, and Tennessee, North Carolina being one of the last holdouts to join the Confederacy. So 11 states in total are going to leave the Union and join the Confederacy, with Jefferson Davis as the president of the Confederacy. The Civil War marks the very first modern war because we are going to see both old methods of war used as well as new methods of war. The use of the cavalry, which are those soldiers on horseback, muzzle rifles, as well as battlefield formations, that style of warfare where you basically they groups line up, troops line up and just fire at one another. Those are going to be your old methods that were still used in this war. However, we've got some new techniques like railroads. The telegraph was going to be used. And Lincoln is going to really pour over these telegraphs that come in with information. The draft is going to be used by both sides. Very primitive submarines are going to be used. Armored ships or ironclad ships, observation balloons, so think like hot air balloons. These were all going to be used that are going to be considered new methods of warfare. The strategy of the Union is going to be called the Anaconda Plan. This plan was developed by Winfield Scott and was a three-part plan. What they basically wanted to do was to divide the South through the Mississippi River, control the access to the Mississippi River's ports, and then capture the Confederate capital at Richmond, Virginia. So what they wanted to do, remember, you are always weaker if you are separated. So groups in numbers are stronger. So if they can divide the South, divide their troops, divide their resources, and control their means of transportation of getting both troops and resources around the Confederacy and to where they need to go, then they felt like they would have a pretty good shot at winning this war. So it was a three-part plan that was going to be used called the Anaconda Plan. The Confederate strategy was completely different. Basically, their offense was a defense. It was completely defensive. Most of the battles fought in the Civil War were fought in the South, which was basically their turf, their homeland. It was what they were familiar with. So theirs is going to be mostly defensive, which really impacts the way they fight this war. And the other thing they were really hoping to gain was European recognition. They wanted European nations to recognize them as a separate country because really at this point they were having to prove that they were a separate nation. And they thought if they could get European recognition, that some of those European nations would then in turn help them out to fight the Union. Now, the only reason that really any European nation would want to do that would be because the South at this point, remember, is going to be ruled by cotton. And that is a really important export that they have. They use that. That was their bread and butter. That was what their economy was based on. And all of that cotton is going to be used in all that textile production overseas and in the Union as well, but really overseas. So they were hoping that that lack of cotton would then spur them on to want to support them in this civil war. So that's going to be what they were hoping for. So their plan is really defensive and then hoping for that European recognition. When you look at the advantages that both sides have, the Union really has much more than the rest of the Confederacy. First of all, they had most of the population. They just had more numbers, which will really come into play as the war drags on. They also had the majority of resources, all of your natural resources, iron ore and coal. They had access to all of that. They also had most of the transportation. They had the majority of the railroad tracks. They had canals, but they also had the most of the industry. So your factories, your means of production was all located in the Union. That was going to be really key when it came to making those war materials to keep this war effort moving. The advantages of the Confederacy are a little different. First of all, they were defending their homes. This is going to give them a much better reason to fight the Union. Um, Fighting to protect and defend your home, literally your home in many of these soldiers' cases, as well as your way of life, was a much better reason to fight than preserving the Union. That was the reason those in the North were fighting at this point. They also have very strong sectional pride. They were very proud of being from the South and very proud of their way of life. That's going to really spur them on in this fight as well. But one of the major benefits that they had was that they had much better military tradition and leadership. Most of the military academies were located in the South, and most of those major leaders were in the South and fought for the Confederacy. They had great generals, generals like Robert E. Lee and Stonewall Jackson. Robert E. Lee, in fact, was from Virginia, and Abraham Lincoln actually went to him first to lead the Union Army. But when Virginia seceded from the Union, Robert E. Lee simply stated that he had to fight for his country. And in this case, he was referring to Virginia. He had felt that strong of a sectional pride to the South and to his home state. So that is going to really kind of sum up where all of those great leaders were. In fact, if they had not had leaders like Robert E. Lee, this war would not have lasted nearly as long as it did. This is what is going to keep the South in this fight for as long as it did.